So in case you miss some of the strategic places, here they are again. And so you can look to your own memory as to whether you saw this stuff or not. But this photo is near the Temple of the Condor. And of course what you can see are two different styles of construction. The lower stuff is polygonal and much bigger blocks that fit together better than the upper stuff. And so since the conventional story is that the Inca built this, why is there this change? And we already know that Machu Picchu was found as a damaged megalithic series of structures. The Inca found it at some point. Highly unlikely that it was Pachacutec who did, because Hiram Bingham himself, when he first went there, he said this would have taken hundreds, if not thousands of years to construct. There's no way it was done in 25 years. You know, they say 30,000 men were on top of the mountain building it. And my first question is, where did they live? What did they eat? Who fed them? Oh, well, maybe it was 50,000 people on top of the mountain? I don't think so. And then we saw this structure. Again, the obvious difference. You see the megalithic below and the Inca above. This building has not been restored since the Inca abandoned it about probably 1535. And the spacing was done by a catastrophic earthquake that went from east to west. And that's what we'll see at all these places. Damage is always east to west, never north to south. We saw that at Machu Picchu. The north-south walls are in perfect shape. East-west ones are pulled apart. So we have more than 200 stories from around the cultures around the world about a flood that destroyed their world. And their world could be an island or a big chunk of a continent. But all over the world, you get this recurring story. The problem with oral tradition is they never give you a time. You know, that's what we always like to ask. Yes, Chief so-and-so, fascinating story, but when did it happen? A long time ago. It's like they won't get quantitative, and it's like, So you have this recurring story. There's no way that it could simply be a coincidence that you have all these different people stating that this event happened, and that they had to flee, and most people died, and that kind of thing. So some kind of event happened from outside of the solar system and entered the solar system and created incredible damage. That's what made the asteroid belt. It's also what I think it tilted one of the planets so it's rotating this way, and our planet is tilted 23.5 degrees, which doesn't make any sense in terms of the natural way the universe works. Everything should be in harmony and spinning and doing this kind of thing. So we get from Plato the concept of the end of Atlantis. And thankfully to him, he learned from Solon, or the information was passed down from Solon, who was Greek, which was passed down from the Egyptian priests. And so the time of that event would have been 11,600 years ago. But of course, everyone thinks Atlantis, you know, it's just mythology. But we're developing scientific evidence that something did happen at that time. So at that time, the megafauna of North America were wiped out very quickly. And it's highly unlikely that it was done by people because it was too fast an event. And with the work of Randall Carlson, who's a geologist and has done a lot of analysis of in Siberia, where they find thousands upon thousands of woolly mammoths that have been flash frozen, buried in the permafrost, with buttercups in their mouths. So something killed them immediately. And not only that, but also their bones are all broken, as if they were thrown a great distance. So this is the way our planet presently works. And it could very well be that about 12,000 years ago, this event happened where something came from outside of the solar system and hit our planet and knocked it by 23.5 degrees. Because ancient traditions talk about that too. They talk about a time when there were only 2 seasons. And that would be the case if the planet's vertical. It's the 23.5 degrees that gives us 4 seasons. So if that's the case, then the woolly mammoths were wandering through a field, and then all of a sudden the planet shifted almost immediately, and that automatically changed the climate and caused them to flash freeze. That would have wiped out most of humanity. It would have changed every environment. Desert or temperate would suddenly become Arctic, tropical would become temperate, so a lot of the life would have died off, and nature would have to rebuild itself. So again, these are just some of the species that disappeared very rapidly in North America. And most scholars say that it was Indians who did it, but the numbers just don't add up. It seems that their environment shifted, and then they couldn't feed themselves and they couldn't feed on others, and that ended the megafauna period of North America. So the first information I started to look up was from this book called Cataclysm, which talks about a cosmic catastrophe 11,500 years ago. And it was even, the foreword was written by Ranflem Ath, who wrote a book called When the Sky Fell, which again is based on oral tradition about one day or one night or forever they knew where the constellations were and everything, and then the next night all of a sudden the constellations had shifted, and that would have happened if the planet had suddenly tilted. And the work of those two was taken up by Barbara Hand-Clough, who's an astrologer, and she's one of the most famous astrologers, and she believes that the first astrology began about 11,500 years ago. It wasn't that people around the world were looking up to the sky because they were fascinated. They were scared because all of a sudden the sky had shifted. And so that, she believes, and other believes, is when astrology began, because they were looking to the heavens because they were afraid that there might be another shift again. And that's when astronomy began and things like that. Also, there's a book by Dr. Paul Laviolette, who's a physicist, called Earth Under Fire, and he believes that the center of our galaxy is a pulsar. It's not a black hole. So what a pulsar, or what a black hole is, of course, is it's constantly absorbing energy that comes anywhere near it. But what a pulsar does, it'll absorb and fill up and then erupt. And that energy will go across the galactic plane, and then it'll again start to absorb. That's why it's called a pulsar. So he believes every 13,000 years, or half precessional cycle, this event happens. And the energy would include gamma rays and all sorts of things, and he thinks that's what caused the end of the last ice age. It was very rapid. And including the fact that the energy went straight through the sun, and that shot plasma in the direction of Earth, and the plasma struck the higher atmosphere, and that caused the flash melting of especially a big chunk of the North Pole, because we know that I'm going to use the 12,000 year period. We know that about 12,000 years ago, thanks to the work of Dr. Robert Schoch, who also, his theory is solar outbursts. He believes that the temperature was very rapid, but very short to start with, and it caused the melting of a big chunk of the North Pole in 2 weeks, and that caused the rising of the sea level by 300 plus feet. That's the flood. That's the disappearance of Atlantis. Atlantis didn't sink, the ocean rose, and those who could survive had to leave. So I looked at all of that stuff, and then I composed my own book based on, I think, factual evidence I saw in each one of their theories. So I put all those theories together, which is what I tend to do anyway, because the same thing with Nazca. I wrote a book about Nazca because no one theory makes any sense. It's not solely this, it's not solely that, it's a combination of different factors depending upon the time frame. So again, we have the concept of Atlantis being in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, but if the ocean rose by 300 to 350 feet, Atlantis could not be in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It was either, I think, in the Caribbean area, or it was Antarctica, Because if you tilt Antarctica by 23.5 degrees, part of it is going to be temperate. And I think that's why there's all this mysterious research going on in Antarctica right now, like a lot of scientific stuff. I think they found something, and they don't want to tell us. But it'll leak out. With the internet, it's going to leak out anyway. Somebody can go down there just on their own and film and send it through the internet or whatever. And of course, other theories about other lost lands like Lemuria, Mu, etc. The concept of Mu is interesting in that I think it was actually Hawaii. Because if you drop sea level by 350 feet, all the Hawaiian Islands connect. And so it doesn't create a continent, but it creates a very big landmass that is quite prominent. That's why even in Polynesian times, when sailors from Tahiti would sail north to go to Hawaii, it was almost impossible to miss because the Hawaiian Islands are a chain 2,500 miles long, so you're going to bounce off of something. You can't target Big Island or Maui, but you're going to hit something. So this is all we have left. We don't have oral tradition going back 12,000 years. We don't have people, or we don't have anything solid except stone monuments that are damaged, but like badly damaged, as we saw. This is, of course, the Quarry Kancha, the outside. And it's kind of weird, again, giving this talk to people who were just there, but it's good. And there are many other structures around Cusco, like this is the Temple of Viracocha. You can see it was built in two sections. The upper section is adobe. The lower section is polygonal stone. So when we go closer to it, again, no mortar, perfectly fits together. Basalt, all of the same uniformity. So all the stone came from the same quarry. Just as we saw in Cusco, the Inca Roca Wall, all that green stone came from one specific quarry, because whoever these megalithic builders were, they were working with resonance and vibration, so the stone had to be the same consistency. But by the time you get to the Inca period, all they're doing is building something. So they rebuilt using any stone they wanted. They had lost, or the knowledge of what these ancient things did was lost. And this structure that we saw again, the basalt megaliths, and then later possibly the Wadi adding onto it, and then the Inca adding onto it again. And here at the far end of the Quarry Kancha, on top you have the white Spanish construction, and then below you have limestone mixed with local clay done by the Inca. And then below that, you have pieces of stone that the Inca found on the site that had fallen down and put back into place roughly. And then on the right-hand side, you have the original megalithic work. So as we saw, the stuff higher is of lower quality than below. And the best book to get about the Inca is called Conquest of the Inca. It's about that thick. You can get it in any bookstore. This is the first drawing ever done by the Spanish of Cusco. And whoever did it distinguished between walls that were about a foot thick, which would be Inca, and walls that were 3 to 6 feet thick, which were the megalithic. So as you can see, the thick lines represent his record of the megalithic work of Cusco. And no building is continuous. You see that there are sections that are really thick and then thin ones. So that shows you by itself that the Inca found a megalithic city that was damaged. And the knobs we saw, the one with the two knobs on the right fits the theory of archaeologists that the knobs were made for lifting the stone up to put into place and then were cut off later. But the Inca never got around to cutting off all the knobs. But the one to the left, that is not the balance point. So if you put a rope underneath it to pull it up, the stone's going to fall down. So that theory doesn't work. And here again we see the repair. We see the polygonal perfectly fitting together. Then some are put up on top but in the wrong place, and then filled in with just local limestone. Because again, the Inca, when they rebuilt it, they just wanted to rebuild something. They didn't know as much about the harmonics and vibrational possibilities of what the structures originally did. But this is what the Inca did, as some of us saw. Okay, they wanted their work to look like the original. So they made the stone in the front fit perfectly together. But in behind, you see how it splays out. And that shows us that the Inca did not have the capability of having pure stone-on-stone construction. But they wanted a look that was continuous with the original work. And we saw the Puma Paw. So we have the megalithic, and then on top of that, Inca repair on the left and modern repair on the right. And this we didn't get to see, but this is in the Sacred Valley. This is an Inca palace, one of the last Inca palaces built, and it's all adobe mud. There's lots of stone in the Sacred Valley, so if the Inca could have done the polygonal complex work, they would have done it in the Sacred Valley. So this again shows that the megalithic work was not done by the Inca. And at Ollantaytambo, we have the massive colca that was constructed during Inca times, but we also have the wall of 60-plus ton stones coming from the top of the mountain in the back. So that clearly shows us not the same civilization. And some of you weren't able to, but if you went around the left-hand side, you would see this, which again shows you repair work of a very inferior quality done by the Inca. And at Machu Picchu as well, we have the clear distinction of the difference between the construction on the left and the construction on the right. If it was all done over a period of 25 years, then in terms of aesthetics, you would not have a beautiful construction and then right next to it have something that looks awful. It's like any neighborhood. You don't go from a mansion to a wooden shack, especially if you drive through Lima. You'll go through poor neighborhoods and then slightly better, slightly better, slightly better. Then Miraflores is very nice. And then as you drive out, it gets not quite as good, not quite as good, not quite as good to poverty. So the Inca were very much into aesthetics. And so they would not have wanted this to look like that. So they found the tower and they built something next to it. And here again with this one, megalithic on the bottom, Inca work on top. And right next to that, which was the Temple of Three Windows, we have this three-sided structure that probably never had a fourth side. And the right side has sunken down into the ground by 2 feet. So when I was there with a geologist, I said, what caused that? It wouldn't have been poor planning, because the foundation of the building is the major thing you think about as you're constructing, because everything else has to be on top of it. So she said that would be probably something like a 9 to 9.5 earthquake that caused the right side to sink down and the wall to be pulled apart. She said if all of this was constructed at the same time, all of the other buildings would be gone, because you have stone and mortar construction. They just would have been flattened. So she said that's your proof right there, that this structure is older than the Inca structures. So the core, which is megalithic, is about 5 to 10% of Machu Picchu. That's what the Inca found. And as you also noticed, all the mountains are domed in the area. But this one, it looks like it has been cut straight off. It's solid, the mountain is solid granite. The Inca had bronze tools. They couldn't have done the work. What you probably also didn't know was the Intihuatana, which is the hitching post, is not simply a stone, it's the top of the mountain. So you have all of that crystal structure underneath it. That's quite fascinating. Then farther from Cusco, thanks to my quadcopter, this is at Syenite. Something snapped that thing in half. It's not that there was a flaw in the stone, because anyone who works with stone tests the solidness of the stone to begin with. All you have to do is simply take a hammer and hit the stone. If it makes a ringing sound, it means it's solid. If it makes a thudding sound, it means that there is probably a flaw or minor cracks in it. So what a sculptor does is test the stone first, because he doesn't want to be finishing a statue of David and then the head suddenly falls off because he didn't see a crack there. So that's like a huge earthquake, ripped that in two. And for tomorrow, we're going to Tiahuanaco with Antonio. And there are two types of stone at Tiahuanaco. You have red sandstone, and you have the gray andesite. The red sandstone comes from 9 miles away, and the andesite comes from 45 miles away. And this is the area where the gray andesite came from. And this has been proven by geologists. They took samples from Pumapunku, then they did a survey of the area. When they got to Viracocha, they took samples from there. The samples matched perfectly. So the H blocks, etc., came from 45 miles away. And the standard story by archaeologists is that the Tiahuanaco culture built reed boats and floated the stones from the volcano down Lake Titicaca. There's not enough Totora reed in the entire lake to make a boat big enough probably to do that. And this is what we're going to see. My estimate is there are 8 or maybe 9 H blocks. There are 8 which are intact and 1 that is broken in half. And each one has different dimensions. So they were not made in a mold. Each one was handcrafted. Because you'll also see that the backs are different. So the theory that there was some kind of manufacturing process pumping them out doesn't work. Each one is unique and has amazing magnetic properties, which I'm going to show you tomorrow. The H blocks especially, there is a relationship between the design of the stone and magnetism. Because the flat surfaces, you get very little, like the big slabs, you get very little variation in magnetism. But in the case of the H blocks, especially one of them, you take a compass and you put it in the upper recess or indent, and you push it to the back, and the compass will spin either 180 degrees or 360 degrees. Antonio and I have done this many times, and we'll do it for you tomorrow. So it seems the more complex the shape, the more complex the magnetism. It's not a question that the stone simply has magnetite or something magnetic in it, because when it was first formed, that it would probably have a uniform magnetism. So it's quite possible that the cutting technology involved magnetism. I don't know what that means, but it also could include the idea that how the stone was moved from the quarry to Pumapunku was using magnetism, as in a craft of some kind, just levitating it underneath and then dropping it off. Ancient aliens. This is the only excavation work they've done. They've gone down between 2 and 3 feet. And they refuse to go below that. And when you ask them, why don't you go deeper? They say, because there's nothing there. Antonio will show you tomorrow, thanks to ground-penetrating radar, that there's at least one big chamber underneath Pumapunku that the archaeologists don't want to know about. So also you see that those stones were left in place, like they excavated, they left the stones in place. And you can see that something just hammered the site and just blew the structures apart. Also, it's quite likely that this was the result of a cataclysm. It could have been that Viracocha at one point was dormant. It could have been dormant when they were doing the cutting of the stone to build Pumapunku. And then when the cataclysm happened, as in you have a rise in sea level of 300 to 350 feet pushing down on the crust of the earth, that would cause volcanoes to suddenly come back to life. So Viracocha may have suddenly come back to life 12,000 years ago, making Pumapunku more than 12,000 years old, and then shot a lot of material into the air that hit Lake Titicaca, creating a tsunami that then buried Pumapunku. The structures at Tiahuanaco are bigger, and Tiahuanaco and Pumapunku are the same place. They were built at the same time. I'll show you the proof of that. So because they're 30-foot tall stones at Tiahuanaco, then they were not completely buried, but Pumapunku, which is only about 10 feet high, suddenly became a mound. And we'll see at the Akapana Pyramid, the whole thing at one point was covered in mud. So a northern tsunami coming from and the lake is big enough to create a tsunami. So the tsunami comes, buries Pumapunku, some stones are still sticking out of the ground at Tiahuanaco. Then 2,000 years ago, approximately, the Tiahuanaco people show up and they go, wow, what are those big stones sticking out of the ground? This place must have been built by the gods. So they took some of the stone structures apart and they built their own buildings, and they never knew Pumapunku was ever there because it was just a mound until Poznański found it and started to excavate. We also find evidence near the restaurant we're going to. This man, who's an archaeologist, was digging down to build the foundation of a building, and he stumbled across an ancient cemetery. But it doesn't look like a normal cemetery because all the bones that were there, like it wasn't perfectly nice burials. All that was there were like broken human bones. So these could be the early inhabitants. You would have to do radiocarbon testing, but just like shattered bones everywhere, about 6 feet down.
When was Pumapunku excavated, Brian?
What's that?
When was Pumapunku excavated?
Starting in the 1920s, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Quite
He
recently, yeah.
Yeah. He spent 50 years there,
Yeah.
and before that, nobody really cared about it. I mean, Tiahuanaco would be an obvious place to do digging and reconstruction, but I think he stumbled across Pumapunku, and then went, what's underneath this hill? And then, oh my God. Because also all of the stone that's at Pumapunku now has been moved around over the course of time. Like the H blocks are not where they once were. We don't know if they were lined up or what. And they even last year, when I went back, they'd moved some of the stones around. And it's like, that destroys any proper study of the place because now you don't know where the things were. That's what makes it, again, a great mystery. But the perfection of the stonework, that, the surfaces of the H blocks are so flat you can't see light anywhere. There are no mistakes. Whoever did this work had incredible state-of-the-art technology, actually better than ours, because even machinists who have come there with me and engineers say, I don't know what technology cut the stone, because normally what we would, you can only reference what you know in terms of technology. And I think it was Chris Dunn who said, you'd have to start with a router, and that would give you nice 90-degree angles. But then the problem is then you have a corner, because the router is a circular spinning tool. So it's cutting to a certain point, and then when it goes vertically, then when it goes horizontally, you have a curve. So then you have to have a secondary tool come in to make the really sharp angle. But we see no place where they made a mistake at all in terms of the depth of cut. Because you would have the odd mistake here and there of a millimeter or something, but nothing. So nobody knows how this stuff was cut. And these are just some of the different shapes and size, or shapes we're going to see, but incredibly precise surfaces. And thankfully, buried by the Cataclysm, that's why some of the surfaces are in such good shape. Because anything facing, we'll see stones where one, like the front maybe, is like perfect still, and the back is heavily eroded. So that thing was lying down. And what saved it was the fact that it was buried in mud for a very long period of time. The environment at Tiahuanaco, which you'll see, is very harsh environment. The weather's basically always awful there. It's either there's too much sun, or there's too much rain, or there's too much wind, or in one day you'll have too much wind and sun and rain all at the same time. Just ugh. So yeah, tomorrow we're going to do a lot of looking at it with a real compass, because an app compass is physical instruments work better than electronic programs. And of course, at Tiahuanaco, we're going to see the sun gate. There are actually 4 or 5 of them, not one. The other ones are lying face down, broken. And what we're going to see is that the Tiahuanaco culture found this lying on the ground. This is the nice surface. This is the surface that was lying down. So they found it and then flipped it over, and they did all the carving. All they found originally were flat surfaces. But like any culture, which we also see that in Egypt, we see where hieroglyphics are carved onto a surface that had to have been made with high technology. But if you find a flat surface that doesn't have something on it, the natural thing to do is put something on it. So we'll see that. And the crack was done a long time ago. Here it is in the 1500s when it was propped back up by the Spanish. And prior to that, it had fallen down and was propped up by the Tiahuanaco people. And the most ludicrous thing of all is these are the tools used to do all the work. Both in Egypt, well, in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Petra, and Peru and Bolivia. We all know that's not true. And the fun thing is when you go to Egypt, the Egyptologists have made a lot of mistakes, which they've actually written down on display. For example, the box on the right that's covered with hieroglyphics is from the dynastic period. That's what the little note says. The one on the left is from the Archaic period. The Archaic period is pre-dynastic. So it's their own stupidity. The one on the left had to have been done with machines. The lid is the same piece of stone as the box. So somehow they were able to not only cut that off, and again, it's like what we see in Cusco. It's the integrity of the material. The box can't be of a different type of stone, and it can't even be a different stone. We see that repeated over and over again. The composition of the stone has to be the same. And this is not granite. This is called syenite, which is a type of granite, but it's very fine. And the stone that we find in Egypt is either from the Aswan Quarry, which is huge. It's actually the whole city is a granite quarry, or it's from the Sinai, which is in the desert next to Israel. So either they were floating the stone from Aswan all the way down to the Giza Plateau. However, what would they make boats out of? Because there are no natural forests in Egypt and haven't been for thousands of years. You can't use date palms, to make a huge barge. The closest location for major wood is in Lebanon, as in the cedars of Lebanon. But that means moving logs or lumber 1,000 miles. So it's likely that, again, the dynastic Egyptians found the box on the left and said, who shall we bury in here? But they made the one on the right. And this is more evidence. This is a box that was never finished. Somebody was attempting to cut the lid off, and you can see that a line was made like a straight line was made in order to figure out the dimensions of the lid, but then all of a sudden the saw started to veer to the right, and that caused the lid to snap off. So they simply abandoned it. And this is exactly the break point. Oops. 2 circular saws working, about 8 feet in diameter, 1/4 of an inch thick. The one on top, suddenly, because the saw is being pushed too fast into the saw, and anyone who's used a table saw will know what happens when you do that. If you try to push the wood too fast, then you start to bog the saw down, then it sets up a vibration, then it starts to burn the wood. So whoever was operating the machine, the top blade was veering to the right, set up a vibration, and snapped the lid off. So they didn't go, oh, let's cut it up into smaller pieces. They just went, oh, well, next. Obviously, the technology was so sophisticated, it's like, bring me another block. Then you have stuff like this in the Cairo Museum, which is called the Schist Plate. And it's not actually made out of schist. It's made out of metamorphosed mud of some kind, very high in vibration. If you were able to hit it, it would probably make a very specific tone. And when we look at the side profile, you see that looks like part of a machine, like something that would spin. You look at the label on the display, and it says lotus vase. So anybody who's ever seen machines working would look at that and go, well, that looks like a machine. The problem with it is this piece is original, so you see the beauty of the continuity, but this one was repaired, I think, in the late 20th century. So they found it broken. Somebody tried to fix it and wound up making a mess out of it. Originally, it would have been perfect spinning thing, but now when people look at it, they go, it doesn't look that great. That's because it has been poorly fixed. And so we have a major display area that has bowls and plates made out of stone of granite, which is 7 out of 10, 10 being diamond, or harder. And there are lots of these made out of porphyry, basalt, diorite, and slate. Slate may not be necessarily super hard, but porphyry, basalt, and diorite can only be cut with diamonds in the modern age. So you look at the displays, and you see perfectly circular bowls. These would have had to have been made on a lathe. There's no other way to do it. And they have probably 100 on display, but there was a cache found of 30,000 of them. So even the labeling says archaic period. So that means these bowls and plates are pre-dynastic. That means that these were made before the potter's wheel was made. Doesn't add up. And here's another example. You see the groove. The only way that could have been made is on a lathe, and a high-speed lathe, which means you had to have electricity. You had to be able to turn the bowl probably at least 3,000 rotations per minute. That's 20th century technology. Nobody had that technology as far as we know before that. So how could these tools like that have existed 5,500 plus years ago? There had to have been a high-tech culture. But you see how dumb these guys are. And here, core drill holes. These are these holes were done with a tube drill in one of the giant boxes, again in granite. So that had to have been at least encrusted with diamond, if not something else. Diamond tool technology was invented in the 1880s. And the Great Pyramid. 2,300,000 multi-ton blocks of stone. Quarried on site. Supposedly built by Khufu. Any engineer who's looked at it and has made calculations will tell you that in order to build that in the time period of 25 to 30 years, one of these multi-ton blocks would have to be cut, moved, shaped, set into place every 2 minutes. That's impossible. So the dynastic Egyptians found the Great Pyramid, and they found it damaged. The Great Pyramid is 8-sided. It's not 4-sided. You can see this at very specific days of the year. And so that makes it way more complicated, just seeing that, than being a 4-sided structure. And when we look at what's left of the casing stone, there's still casing stone at the bottom of it. The casing stone is made out of a different type of limestone called tura. And the core of the Great Pyramid, again, the stone was on the site itself. The Tura limestone comes from 35 miles away, I think. So if the story goes that after the fall of Egypt and the invasion of other cultures, that they were peeling the casing stone off in order to build Cairo, why did they leave them at the bottom? That doesn't make sense. I think what happened was that the Great Pyramid and the other about 8 like beautiful pyramids that are still there. I think they are 12,000 plus years old. There was a cataclysmic event. These things were energetic structures, and because of the cataclysm, and they were energetic, and in some way they were influenced by running water underground, because the Giza Plateau goes down at least 6 to 10 levels of tunnels underneath. So if you have water running through these tunnels of very specific dimensions, you can set up a vibration of the water movement. So that could have meant that the pyramids were energy-enhancing structures. And also, the Great Pyramid doesn't simply sit on the Giza Plateau, it locks into it. That's a lot more work than simply building it on the ground. If you lock it in, again, there's a reason for that. And it could be that what the Great Pyramid was doing was it was amplifying the energy of the earth itself, just like a natural machine, not powered by anything, no chemicals or whatever. It's just whoever built it in a very specific location with the underground water happening, and then it was amplifying the energy and sending the energy to the obelisks, because the obelisks were not built by the dynastic Egyptians. The dynastic Egyptians built in limestone and sandstone. They couldn't cut granite and they couldn't cut basalt. So anything which is granite or basalt is pre-dynastic. And this is evidence that there are chambers under the Giza Plateau, all locked off, of course. If you walk around the conventional areas that they say, yes, you're allowed to photograph this, you're allowed to look at that, etc. But, and they're so numerous here. This is out of bounds, but Yusuf Awiyan takes us to places we're not supposed to go. These were used by the dynastic Egyptians as tombs, but they didn't make them, they found them. If you find a hole in the ground that's kind of nice shaped, you're going to bury somebody in it. And especially evidenced by going further out of bounds after paying bakshish, and you encounter the shafts. 15 feet by 15 feet, presently going down about 60 feet, but originally going down hundreds of feet and connecting with the tunnel system. It's only 60 feet deep now because it's full of sand. But if this opening was 12,000 years old, and you have sand blowing for 12,000 years, it's going to fill up the hole pretty well. This is a piece of basalt, and when you look at the striations, which shows you the cutting rate of the saw, like a flat saw, this saw was cutting 1 millimeter per revolution, or 1 millimeter per movement. That's 500 times more efficient than what a modern diamond saw could do. So very advanced technology. Can't be done today. And just the inside of the Great Pyramid. We thought this was actually granite, but it's limestone. And the obelisks. The obelisks, the Egyptians, the dynastic people found them. There used to be 11 at Karnak, perfectly lined up, as if it was like a Wi-Fi system. The pyramids produce the energy, the obelisks receive the energy. You have high crystal content in the core of the Great Pyramid, especially in the King's Chamber, which would have been the residence structure, and then these are solid granite with quite a high quartz crystal content. So what powers anybody's watch is crystal technology. So this is ancient crystalline technology. And when we get to the Sphinx enclosure, or Sphinx Temple, which is in front of the Sphinx, this is the process of how the Sphinx was constructed. It wasn't just chipped out of the ground. The only thing originally that was seen was the head, because that was a natural thing called a yardang. So whoever did the construction of the Sphinx itself cut multi-ton blocks out in order to create the shape, some of them being 40 tons plus. And what they would do is cut one piece out, put it on the ground, cut the next one out, put it right next to it, because we can see the erosion lines are continuous. So that, that's pretty complex stuff. Also, as everyone knows, the head of the Sphinx was recarved at least once. For most of its time, the head has been sticking out of the sand and part of the chest. But over time, because the Sphinx is in an enclosure, like underground or under the surface, because all these giant blocks were moved, the sand naturally builds up. And so they've had to dig it out. And there are even hieroglyphics that say at the time of Khufu that they were digging the Sphinx out again. So the Sphinx is obviously older, proven by Robert Schoch, because wind and sand will produce horizontal erosion. But the Sphinx enclosure has vertical erosion, which can only be done by water. And the last time there was that much rain in Egypt for an extended period of time was at least 12,000 years ago. So the Sphinx is at least 12,000 years old. Another thing people don't know is this boardwalk is relatively recent that they put on there. And the reasoning why they put it there, they say, is for the benefit of the tourists. But if you look at it, this shape here can be taken out. This is bedrock here, that's bedrock over here, but this area are big blocks. That's showing you the entrance to the Sphinx. They've already found it, but they're hiding it by putting the boardwalk over top. And also the bent pyramid. Again, they say, well, somebody, after the collapse of Egypt, people came and took the stone for building projects, but if you look at it, it has two angles. The casing stone on the bottom half is still largely intact. The casing stone on the upper half is gone. Nobody would start taking the stone off the surface from the top. You start from the bottom. So again, it could be harmonics and energy involved, and that the pyramid system, because they were vibrational, something happened to them to cause them to go offline or to be hyper-energized. And that could have caused the casing stone to simply blow off. And that's further evidenced by the Red Pyramid, because the sand in front of the Red Pyramid is the casing stone. That's not somebody there with a bunch of hammers whacking away. It looks like it was just pulverized and blew off the surface. Because the Tura limestone especially is a great insulator. You have the granite in the core, which is crystal. So crystal conducts energy very well. So the casing stone could have simply been like an insulating layer to protect the energetic core. And inside the Red Pyramid, the harmonics are just spectacular. And that room, like we saw in some of the stuff in Cusco, responds to Om. Like the tone of Om is the one that makes it go woo, and only that. Again, which is octaves above what the Earth produces. These are pieces of some of the turned bowls that we were able to see. This cache was found at Saqqara, buried, and again, the estimate is somewhere between 30,000 to 50,000 of them were found. That's a lot of lathe work. Next, we go, into the Serapeum, which is underground at Saqqara. It's a series of 2 tunnels containing 28, I think it is, boxes, most of them made out of granite or syenite. Again, the location of the 2 quarries is either 500 miles away at Aswan or at least 300 miles away in the eastern desert. And each one of these, the Serapeum was rediscovered in the 19th century, and it's unless you have a lot of electricity on, it's pitch black. So if the dynastic Egyptians had constructed this, well, they just couldn't, because They didn't have electricity, obviously. They would have had to have, in order to move the boxes underground, they would have to have been using torches of some kind, but there's no soot anywhere on the ceilings. So whoever did the work was moving the boxes underground with very little tolerance when they were going around corners. They had to have had high-tech lighting of some kind. And this is one of the boxes weighing 100 tons. The box itself weighs 70 tons. The lid weighs 30 tons. The lid and the box are always from the same piece of stone. And archaeologists state emphatically that the hieroglyphics and the stone work itself are contemporary. But all you have to do is look at that. Look at the glow of the undersurface of that lid. That lid would hermetically seal the box. And that is ultra high level of technology. It'd be very difficult actually impossible for us to do it today. Because the bottom piece is one piece of stone. And so Christian sent out letters to stone manufacturing companies in the US. He sent them a picture of one of these and he said, I have an unlimited budget. How much would it cost to make one of these? And all the replies he got back were, we can only make it if we're allowed to make it in 6 pieces. It's impossible to make that out of one piece. And that's the detail of these. It's almost childlike, the hieroglyphics on the surface, as compared to the surface. The surface is super high-tech. Somebody with a nail, it looks like, was carving. And the other, yeah, so they're not contemporary. This is the interior. The interior of the box. Also, the box responds to the sound of Om. And luckily, you pay enough, you're allowed to climb inside these things. That's a representation of supposedly a copy of the oldest astrology calendar in the world. The original, though, is in Paris, and it starts at the time of Leo, which is 12,000 years ago. So maybe astrology began after the Cataclysm. This is the famous helicopter on the left, tank on the right, and submarine. Some people say that that this is a representation of high technology, and others say it's simply different layers of carving of hieroglyphics, because especially during the time of Ramses loved to advertise who he was, so his carvers would cut deeply into the hieroglyphics of his ancestors just to erase their memory. And now we're in the Osirian. That stone as well either came from Aswan or from the eastern desert. The blocks weigh about 40 tons. The damage was not done by anybody either during dynastic times. You'll see the upper one here. Someone's trying to break that one by putting grooves in it and probably gave up. But the major damage looks like something catastrophic hit this place. Cross section of a tube drill. The drill was hollow. It was a core drill about this big, and the wall of the drill was about 1/8 of an inch. We don't have tools today that are like that, because if you have a tube drill and then you want to encrust diamonds onto it, you have to put it on the outside surface, the inside surface, and the front, and that makes it wider. So usually a diamond tube drill will be twice the dimension of the tube itself. And this is like maybe 1/8 of an inch thick. And then at Karnak, we find stones there that look like they were hit by, this is a good example of being hit by super high heat super quickly, because the internal structure is different. The whole stone was hit by massive heat over a split second, and that caused the stone to expand and crack the surface. And we see that when we look inside. The crystalline structure inside is bigger than outside. And again, we had geologist Susan Moore with us, and she said that would be several thousand degrees happening instantaneously. That could be evidence of the solar plasma burst hitting Karnak. And as we walk down the Holy of Holies, or the Sacred Way of Karnak, all the surfaces are burnt off. You see the erosion? Like that? As if an energy went straight through down through this specific area. And the Holy of Holies is supposed to be perfectly east-west, because that's what you find at ancient places. But the Holy of Holies here is off east-west by 23.5 degrees. And like here again, you see that damage. That's not just age. That's something blasting past it and just blowing the surface off. Also, these the giant statues that we find in Egypt were all found buried underground. So they were found by the dynastic Egyptians, and evidence for that is again, what's his name? Ramses II. You see the sword here that comes down. This is his cartouche that was carved into it, but it goes over the surface of the sword. That doesn't make sense. So obviously the sword is original, and Ramses had his cartouche carved onto it. So as his priests and other people were in the Karnak area, as they were digging around for building temples, they found these giant statues buried underground, as if they had been hit by a massive cataclysmic energy that threw them. And this is a drawing by Chris Dunn of the incredible accuracy, almost bilaterally perfect. Some alteration in the headdress, but in terms of the eyes and stuff, it's all like super precise. Then when you get to the Colossi of Memnon, each one of these two, you have the statue, and then you have the base. The statue itself weighs 720 tons, and the quarry is 300 miles away. It is quartzite, which is a super hard material, much harder. You can't carve quartzite even with hardened steel. The back surfaces are really quite intact, but the fronts, again, with Susan Moore, the geologist, she looked at that and she said heat blasted the surfaces off, like blasted the face off. This statue originally weighed 1,000 tons. It was a seated figure. And it was one piece of stone, 1,000 tons, again from Aswan, maybe, or the Eastern Desert. And something hit it. It's not invading tribes or something decided to push it over. Something blew it up. Because you can see the same direction of the damage at Karnak is on the same surface of this giant statue. It looks like the surface has been burnt off. Also, the Valley of the Queens, the precision of the cutting of these chambers, of which there are lots, could not have been done by the dynastic Egyptians, because it's too well done, and there are too many of them. So the dynastic Egyptians found the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens with these shafts and tunnels going at an angle into the ground. They decided we should bury our royalty here because somebody did the work for us. And this is further proven here when you go off limits. This is an underground series of tunnels near the Valley of the Queens that we were allowed in, and this is one area that's open to the surface, but the rest of it was all underground. And we were in there for about half an hour, and when we told the caretaker, or asked him how far does this tunnel go, he said the Valley of the Queens and the Valley of the Kings connect together. It's one system. Then you go to Elephantine Island. This giant chunk of stone is granite carved out of one piece. And again, it looks like it has literally been thrown onto its back. The precision of the stonework is incredible. And the 1,200-ton unfinished obelisk, supposedly being made by Queen Hatshepsut, but this is something, again, that the Egyptians found. Something suddenly caused a stop in the work, maybe a cataclysmic event. And the it could have been also that they were making this giant obelisk that had to be specific dimensions, but when they got down a certain distance, they found this big crack, and they were planning on going deeper. So with a crack in the stone, that obelisk wouldn't resonate because it has a flaw in it. So maybe they just abandoned it. But this is the cutting technology that was involved, almost like a device that was scooping the surface inside. Very totally even, each one of these indentations. And this is Lebanon. So that's the famous mountain whose name I forget. This is where the fallen angels came to earth in the Bible. Sorry? Yeah, no. Mount Hermon, that's right. And we're on our way to the quarry at Baalbek. So again, you see the surfaces. This highly unlikely. This is hand tools. This is one of the stones that's still in the quarry, about 800 tons. The Romans came and found it and cut pieces off of it. And this is the stone of the pregnant woman. That's Stephen Mailer and myself. It's still attached to the bedrock, 1,200 to 1,500 tons. And it, again, was never finished, as if some event had happened that caused the workers to stop. That just gives an indication. There's me on top of this thing. And here's another view of the quarry itself. Big stones underneath. There's a big crack in it, in the bottom area. So maybe work was stopped because they found a flaw. Then when you go a mile away, you get to Baalbek itself, and you have the trilithon, which are 3 1,000-ton blocks in a row. The work on top is inferior. So the Romans obviously found this partially finished structure damaged by something, and then they built on top of it. That's an 800-ton block at Baalbek. Here are some 400-ton blocks at Baalbek. And this is work that maybe the Romans did. But this is another, that's Irene, that's another massive block. You see the stone on top is smaller. And also what we find are 300 granite columns that originally were all one piece. If you put your hand on the surface, those columns were made on lathes. And these are 20 feet, these were originally 20 feet long. We don't have lathes today that can do that. But you feel the surface. There's no way they were done by hand. And something broke all of these things, as attested to here. This, of course, you had invading armies coming in and breaking some stuff, but some catastrophic force likely did the first damage to the site. And more or less finally, we're going to Petra in Jordan. This is the Sikh, which is 1.5 miles long. It's a natural formation. A river has been cutting through here for maybe millions of years. But curiously, on the left side and the right side, somebody carved channels for moving water. We had geologist Susan Moore with us. She said the stone is 7 out of 10 in hardness, so only diamond can cut it. The standard story is Petra was constructed by nomadic Arabs called the Nabateans, who literally came by camel and built this stone city, which is 12 kilometers long, in 100 years. But when you go there, what's really obvious is the following. This is the treasury. The treasury and all of Petra was found by the Nabateans. They were very good business people. So what they did is, over the course of time, as their civilization and trade routes expanded, they brought good sculptors from Greece. And the Nabateans said, we want this structure to look really nice because it looks kind of plain. And they went, okay. And they spent several years making the treasury look very beautiful. But the treasury is 1% of Petra. Most people think this is Petra. It's a tiny bit of Petra. As you walk the 12 kilometers through the city, you encounter, this is a back wall. That had to have been machined. There's no way it was done by hand. Because you see very even cutting marks. Again, the stone is 7 out of 10 hardness. Only our diamond technology can do that today. But maybe this is a completely different type of technology. And it's hard to see here, but there are little carved steps going up the side, both sides. So I think that's where the Greek artists, sculptors, built a scaffolding system. That was the way they were able to actually get up and do the detail work itself. But as we walk through Petra, we see these massive chambers that have no function, and they're absolutely huge in size. And keep walking, and you find flat surfaces that were never either never finished or never ornamented the way that the treasury was, and just lots and lots of them. I think there are probably like 100 of these things there. And somebody cut these steps into the stone very roughly and laid clay pipe. So whoever made the original channels had some kind of high technology. Then the Nabateans and later people, where they found sections broken, then they laid some clay pipe to make the water still run. But you just keep walking through Petra. Here you see one of them has been made into bathrooms. And this picture, the 2 columns on the left are made of several sections. The 3 on the right were carved out of the bedrock. So the ones on the left were a repair, maybe by the Nabateans or the Romans later. But again, you see the precision of the lines. They're at an angle coming down. This chamber by itself, that's Irene. Whoever made that chamber removed 300,000 cubic feet of material. And that's just one of many. This is Nabatean/Roman work. So you could look at that and go, oh, I understand how somebody with maybe steel tools could have done this, but not that. So again, that's the complexity of these sites. You have the original megalithic, then culture after culture after culture. And then the archaeologists say, no, the one culture did it all. It's like, no. Here too, this is part of the walkway going to the end of Petra. On the left-hand side, it was carved out of the bedrock. And then on the right side, it was repaired by the Nabateans and later people. And finally, at the end, that's Irene again. You get to this one, which is called the monastery. That's right. You see, it's quite, like all of the stuff is quite plain. Simple shapes, except the treasury by itself is like very ornate. But all the rest of it is this. So this is the original construction look. And the Nabateans had enough money to be able to make the treasury look, very fine. But they likely found it like this. This is part of the 12-kilometer system going through Petra. There are people living in some of these chambers. They're also parking cars in them. And a few more slides. This is underneath Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So that one stone is 11.5 feet by 41 feet long. When you want to talk about the Nephilim, that's when you're talking about, this is pre-Israelite people. This is the so-called Canaanites. This is, again, it's underground. That's another huge block that they found. You can walk through this tunnel, which we're going to do when we go to Israel. Then in Greece, which Hugh's seen a lot of stuff in Greece. Cyclopean stuff. This is Italy. This is Japan. This is Easter Island. Easter Island, of course, all the heads. Some of you know, of course, that the heads are attached to complete bodies. This is one of the biggest ones that was excavated by Thor Heyerdahl. So you have 900 of these, and unless the head is broken off, they're attached to a body. And the question is, Why is most of it underground? According to Robert Schock, who's an expert on erosion, because he's the one who has proven that the Sphinx is ancient, he said that could be sedimentation, and some of these could be 12,000 plus years old. And that's me in Cusco, showing the obvious difference that we saw of megalithic work on the right, Inca work on the left. Thank you.